This lecture covers policing and school-to-prison pipeline. As we're reviewing this particular section, make sure that you understand how to answer some of these particular questions. What is racial profiling? What does racial profiling look like? Do you think it is a legitimate tool for law enforcement to use for the purposes of crime prevention? Why or why not? In our previous lecture, we discussed the growth of the mass incarceration system. And a couple of the areas that we talked about were different policing strategies that have led to the growth of the mass incarceration system. And in particular, we need to look at tactics and strategies involved with policing that impact the rates at which people are being jailed. So, for example, there are some policing practices such as there are some policing tactics like racial profiling and hotspot policing that we're going to talk about today, as well as practices in terms of the school-to-prison pipeline, which is the practices of institutions and less so about police. Racial profiling is the practice which involves singling out a person or persons for attention based solely on their race or ethnicity. Profiling refers to the police practice of viewing certain characteristics as indicators of criminal behavior. For those of you who've ever watched any sort of police show or a cop show, a lot of the times that this would include psychological characteristics, if people have particular habits, if the habits are related to a particular form of sexuality. It could also be about their focus on particular groups of people. So profiling is a practice largely used within law enforcement. Now, racial profiling in law enforcement is a different thing. Now, it's important to note that in terms of racial profiling, there's a narrow definition, and the narrow definition of racial profiling is that racial profiling occurs when a police officer stops, questions, arrests, and/or searches someone solely on the basis of a person's race and ethnicity. The broad definition is racial profiling occurs when a law enforcement officer uses race or ethnicity as one of several factors and is assigned to stop, question, arrest, and/or search someone. You should be able to identify the differences between the two and understand that the only legal form of racial profiling is the broad definition, in which race is only one of the factors, as opposed to the sole factor. And you need to be able to differentiate this for the purposes of the test. So one thing to look at, or what studies have shown, is looking at racial or ethnic profiling. And in a survey that was done focusing on college-aged students, they asked 3 questions. They asked, do you think it's ever justified for police to use racial or ethnic profiling when motorists are stopped on roads and highways, when passengers are stopped at security checkpoints in airports, and when attempting to prevent theft or in shopping malls or stores? Here is the findings. Generally speaking, people said that that 31% felt that it was justified to racially profile on roads and highways. 67% said no, it's never justified. That changes a little bit in terms of airports, where they said 45% said yes, it's justified to use racial profiling at security checkpoints in airports, and 53% said no. And then when we're looking at shopping malls or stores, only 25% said yes, and 72% no. The reason I show you this is so that we can better understand the discourse around racial profiling and how this kind of plugs into popular culture and people's perception of what danger is and when race is important in terms of signifying that danger. And so this sort of gives us a snapshot of how people are thinking. What's important to note in terms of racial profiling is that according to former Attorney General John Ashcroft, he wrote that racial profiling at its core concerns the invidious use of race or ethnicity as a criterion in conducting stops, searches, and other law enforcement investigative procedures. It is premised on the erroneous assumption that any particular individual of one race or ethnicity is more likely to engage in misconduct than any particular individual of another race or ethnicity. Racial profiling in law enforcement is not merely wrong, but also ineffective. I think there's a few different things in here that are important to pull out. First and foremost is the idea that one racial group is more likely to conduct criminal activity over another. The other thing that is important to note is that research has shown exactly what Attorney General Ashcroft wrote here, is that racial profiling, in fact, has not helped in terms of bringing down crimes or actually correctly identifying criminals. And so these are important things to note, is that while it's been used as a practice, or people try to justify it as a practice, it's not actually efficient or actually been helpful in terms of picking up people who had actually committed crimes. Oftentimes, when organizations or police forces have been asked why use racial profiling, they use what some have called the profiling hypotheses. This hypothesis goes something like this: that if officers stop more blacks, they will increase their chances of finding criminals because criminals are more likely to be black. As you can probably see from this hypothesis or this rationale, it is a very sort of chicken and egg kind of argument, meaning it's very circular, in that, of course, if you focus on African Americans, you're more likely to arrest them, therefore reinforcing the idea or stereotype that you had that blacks were more criminals. And so therefore you use that assumption then to pick up or try to arrest more African Americans. So it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that's what's wrong with this particular hypothesis. In terms of the research on racial profiling, it's important to note that research shows that racial profiling actually makes police less accurate, not more so, in catching criminal activities, because it wastes resources on what we call false positives among people police would never otherwise stop. For example, erroneously arresting black lawyers on their way to work simply because they're black, as opposed to actually looking at other clues that may actually hint at criminal activity. And because the focus, and that's pretty much what they've talked about, is that by focusing solely on race, you actually stop looking for other things that may be material to a case. Research has verified that people of color are more often stopped for traffic violations than whites, and then more white police increase. So when we hire more white police, it increases the number of arrests of non-whites, but do not systematically affect the number of whites arrested. What's also interesting to note is that increases in the number of minority police are associated with significant increases in arrests of whites, but have little impact on arrests of non-whites. So in other words, when you have police officers of different races, it actually increases the likelihood that you'll actually have that you will actually arrest people, white folks, for violating crimes, but doesn't do anything in terms of increasing or decreasing the numbers of minorities who are arrested. Now I want to kind of focus on a couple of the strategies that have fed into the increase of African Americans and Latinos in the mass incarceration system. First, let's focus on hotspot policing. This particular strategy focuses police resources on a small geographic area, usually in urban settings, where they believe crime is thought to be most likely to occur based on arrest reports of crimes, specifically street crime and/or burglaries. The appeal of focusing limited resources on a small number of high-activity crime areas is based on the belief that if crime can be prevented at these hotspots, the total crime across the city might also be reduced. So how would this look in practice? Well, pretend that they were actually trying to use hotspot policing to look at Sacramento City College. The X's represent squad cars and how they might deploy if, in fact, they decided that Sacramento City College was a hotspot. So let's say that the district has a total of 7 police cars. If they basically looked at reports and felt that there had been a spike in crimes at City College, what they may do is deploy 4 police officers or 4 squad cars directly into City College. They may put one on the edge, as you'll see there on where the line that says 24th, right? And then they'll use their other 2 squad cars to circulate the rest of their district, which might be South Land Park or Curtis Park, which is those outlier X's on the top right and the bottom left. So the hotspot policing, what usually ends up happening is because they're focused on such a small area, they end up doing a lot of arrests or ticketing in one particular area, which of course reaffirms the idea that this area has lots of crime. When in reality, there may be crime happening in other areas, but our attention isn't focused there. So hotspot policing can adopt a variety of strategies to control crime in problem areas, including order maintenance and drug enforcement crackdowns, increasing gun searches and seizures, and zero-tolerance policing. In other words, what they decide to do when they're hotspot policing can focus on different elements. The problem with this particular tactic is, again, as I noted on the previous slide, is that it could end up reaffirming pre-existing stereotypes of an area. Some of the pros of using hotspot policing is that it helps use limited resources strategically. The police and Department of Justice data shows that it cuts down, right, on crime in particular areas for a specific amount of time, and that this type of policing is empirically driven. It's based off of data. The cons is that it's racial profiling, policing places and not people. They basically say this isn't racial profiling, that we're not actually policing very specific people, we're just policing particular places. But they're ignoring the fact that that in particular neighborhoods or geographic regions, you have disproportionately high populations of particular minority groups. Research on stop and frisk policy shows that racial minorities are disproportionately targeted, which I've already talked about before. That the data methodology may be flawed, that a place may be deemed a hotspot based on the targeting of specific communities. It's not that crime doesn't exist in other areas, and it's just likely that it's not being caught because police resources are concentrated elsewhere. All right, so now I want to focus on the school-to-prison pipeline. This refers to policies and practices that push our nation's school children, especially our most at-risk children, out of classrooms and into juvenile and criminal justice systems. This pipeline reflects the prioritization of incarceration over education. In this particular graphic, I invite you to take a look at some of the statistics that advocates for school discipline reform have talked about. And that, for example, 40% of students expelled from U.S. schools each year are Black. 70% of students involved in in-school arrest or referred to law enforcement are Black or Latino. And that Black and Latino students are twice as likely to not graduate high school as whites. So in other words, part of what they're connecting is that the criminalization of, in particular, African-American Latinos has created a conduit or a pipeline instead of from your K through 12 or your high school to college, instead of high school to prisons. Take a closer look at this graphic because it really kind of tells you a story of the experiences of African Americans and Latinos as well as those who are in the foster care system. Students from two groups tend to disproportionately be in the pipeline: racial minorities and children with disabilities. African American students are 3.5 times more likely than their white counterparts to be suspended or expelled according to the U.S. Department of Education. And Black children constitute 18% of students, but they account for 46% of those suspended more than once. Part of the reason we look at this is that not that we want parity, meaning that we want the same amount of arrests or the same amount of suspensions based on population, but we do see that a particular group is focused on when it comes to school discipline policies. A recent U.S. Department of Education study found that more than 70% of students arrested in school-related incidents or referred to law enforcement are Black or Hispanic. So in other words, this is significant because students' first contact with police is not as an adult, but it's happening in the context of junior high or high school, which means that the potential for having a record starts earlier. In other studies, researchers found racial differences in suspension rates have widened since the early 1970s, and that suspension is being used more frequently as a disciplinary tool. In the past, suspension used to be a last resort, meaning that a student would have had multiple infractions before they were suspended. Now, with more draconian laws in schools or draconian rules in schools, we find that the students are getting suspended much quicker than they used to be. Research shows that removing children from schools does not improve their behavior, and instead it greatly increases the likelihood that they'll drop out and wind up behind bars. This is particularly true for those who are from low-income and urban areas, because when they're suspended and have to stay at home, there is not necessarily the resources to make sure that there is adult supervision and oversight to keep them out of trouble. So oftentimes these students who are at home on suspension get into additional trouble with the authorities. For students with disabilities, the numbers are equally troubling. 8.6% of public school children have been identified as having disabilities that affect their ability to learn. These students make up 32% of youth in juvenile detention centers. Part of what this statistic talks about is that oftentimes we know that when a student is having trouble learning, it works on their self-esteem. And so sometimes they act out. Our inability to diagnose learning disabilities often means that these students act out because of their frustration in school, and that what we really need to do is not to invest more resources into discipline, but more resources into addressing these disabilities. About 1 in 4 black children with disabilities were suspended at least once versus 1 in 11 white students. And again, that this points to some of the racial dynamics of the ways in which school suspensions are happening. So according to the American Civil Liberties Union, they said there's sort of 3 major stops on the school to prison pipeline that lead to the type of statistics that we just went through. And those 3 stops include failing public schools, zero tolerance and other school discipline policies, and policing school hallways. As many of you already know, in large part from our previous section on education, in terms of failing public schools, we know that there's inadequate resources, particularly in our K-12 system. We have overcrowded classrooms. We have a lack of qualified teachers. So when we talk about a lack of qualified teachers, we're talking about a very specific dynamic. Is that in order to be a teacher, you should be credentialed, meaning that that after you get your bachelor's degree, you should go on to get a graduate degree, and that you have to go through a process of learning how to do classroom management, understanding how to deliver curriculum, understand how to do assessment, and that eventually you go through a testing system in which you get your credential. In the state of California, however, we rely quite a bit on what we call emergency credentialing. Emergency credentialing means that people will take the CBEST. This is the same test you would do to be a substitute teacher. And if you could prove that you're able to teach in a need area, for example, if you're bilingual and can speak and you can teach in another language, or if you're someone who can teach math or science where we don't have enough teachers, they will emergency credential you to teach at the school, which is great. However, these teachers are not fully certified and don't understand, for example, how to do classroom management and help and deal with discipline issues. And oftentimes when you're unable to deal with discipline issues, you're more likely to call the police. There's also insufficient funding for extras, for example, counselors, special education, or even textbooks. The irony here, right, is that textbooks and counselors or special education should not be considered extras. So what we're talking about is that we don't have the infrastructure in schools in order to make sure that we achieve student success. The failure to meet educational needs increases disengagement and dropout rates. And we understand from educational research that those 2 things, disengagement and dropouts, that there's a strong correlation between later court involvement, meaning that the likelihood that they will end up in court for criminal activity. Schools may encourage dropouts in response to test-based accountability regimes, which create incentives to pass out low-performing students to boost overall test scores. In other words, if those students drop out, the test scores of the school look much better. Also, there's zero tolerance policies and other school discipline. In other words, when we talk about something being zero tolerance, it means that when you do something wrong, immediately you're suspended, right? Or you go to the harshest possible punishment. So this refers to policies that automatically impose severe punishment regardless of circumstances. So they don't take into, so for example, if someone's missing or truant from school, they may not take into account that they needed to take care of their younger brother or sister. They just impose harsh punishment. Under these policies, it's also important to note that students have been expelled for bringing nail clippers or scissors to school because it goes against the policy of no weapons in schools. Rates of suspensions have increased dramatically in recent years from 1.7 million in 1974 to 3.1 million in 2000, and have been most dramatic. And this is that these increases have been most dramatic for children of color. Overly harsh disciplinary policies push students down the pipeline and into the juvenile justice system. In other words, the more contact that students have with police, the more often that they're thrown out of schools, the more likely that they are to be picked up by police for infractions. And then, of course, we also have policing the school hallways. Many under-resourced schools become pipeline gateways by placing increased reliance on police rather than teachers and administrators to maintain discipline. In other words, that means if there is dust up in a classroom where children or students are fighting, that instead of the principals or school security guards getting involved, they call the police. And at the second that police are called, the potential for arrest and then creating a police record for these students increases. Growing numbers of districts employ school resource officers to patrol school hallways, not highways, often with little or no training in working with youth. In other words, these individuals don't understand the developmental processes of how to de-escalate or how to work with students to make sure that they don't act out. And part of what we're arguing, or what school advocates have argued, is that we really need to model ways in which we're not being hyper-aggressive with students. As a result, children are far more likely to be subject to school-based arrests, the majority of which are for nonviolent offenses such as disruptive behavior, than they were a generation ago. So what you're having happen is that the first arrest on people's record is actually coming in school. And so this starts their criminal record even earlier. And as we know, with 3 strike laws and all these and misdemeanors leading to longer sentences, this is another dynamic that adds to the mass incarceration system. Groups like the ACLU have argued that there should be many reforms that are needed in terms of best practices. Instead of pushing children out, teachers need a lot more support and training for effective discipline, and that school needs to use best practices for behavior modification to keep kids in school. Keeping at-risk kids in class can be tough, particularly with educators under pressure to meet accountability measures, but they're in a unique position to divert students away from the pipeline. In other words, educators and teachers need support in terms of making sure that students stay in school instead of just pushing them out into the school-to-prison pipeline. I would read through these. Teaching Tolerance, which is another advocacy organization, also argues that there are a number of different things that we can do to make sure that students stay in school. This is the use of positive behavior interventions and supports. In other words, affirming when people are doing good things. Compile annual reports on the total number of disciplinary actions that push students out of the classroom based on gender, race, and ability. In other words, pay attention to who's being targeted by these policies. Create agreements with police departments and court systems to limit arrest at school and use of restraints such as mace and handcuffs. Because again, once you treat students like a criminal, this basically communicates to them that they are a criminal, which is a very dangerous road to go down. Provide simple explanations of infractions and prescribe responses to the Student Code of Conduct to ensure fairness. Create appropriate limits on the use of law enforcement in public schools, and train students on the use of positive behavior supports for at-risk students. So we've gone through these are a lot of the practices that are happening, both within policing as well as in schools, that have led to the growth of the mass incarceration system. Be clear about how this plugs into the previous lecture as you're doing your notes.